Hey everybody. For today's few Mighty Marvel minutes, we're going to be talking about the concept of role selection and deciding whether to be a generalist or a specialist. Later this week, on Friday, we're going to do a live deck build using some of these concepts, and we're going to focus on 3 of these daily videos that I've talked about. Our combo drive, which is really our decision if we want to be a ramp or a burst-based deck. We talked about that last week. We're going to talk about today's video, role-playing, figuring out if we want to be a generalist character or a specialist character. Those might seem like they're intertwined, and they strongly are, but they can still be decoupled. And then we're going to talk about math, cost curves, resources. We're going to revisit the power of decision. There were some really, really good comments on the YouTube video. I suggest you go read them, but I'm also going to overview them for everybody on the channel on Wednesday. So once we have those 3 topics covered, we can do this live deck build and see how these 3 things interact. But for today, we're going to talk about role player and generalist versus specialist selection. So what is a generalist and what is a specialist? What do I mean by selecting a role? When you're building your deck, you're going to want to figure out what your deck wants to do, beyond just how fast it wants to do it or the pace it wants to do it at. And what I would say is a generalist is a jack-of-all-trades character. This is a character that wants to fill gaps and handle whatever the board state throws at them. Some hero examples might be a fully built-up Iron Man or Miss Marvel, or Captain America right from the get-go. He can remove extra threat, he can deal extra damage, or he can defend really well. So he can kind of do everything. A specialist is a character or a role that does 1, maybe 2 things, but they do those things extremely, extremely well. A hero example of this might be Black Widow with removing threats, Hawkeye with dealing damage, or Drax with defending. There's going to be something they do that is like the best that can be done. And that's what a specialist wants to strive for. So you might be thinking, okay, well, once I've picked my hero, that tells me whether I'm a generalist or a specialist. And my answer to that is no. You can definitely build heroes in both of these categories, even the ones that I just listed on that previous slide. We'll talk about how you build into one of these roles here in a second. You might be thinking, okay, well, you talked about burst and ramp, so all specialist decks must be bursty because they want to do something really well, they better do it really fast. And the answer again is no. You can build a very specialized damage deck that takes a while to ramp to it, and you can build a very all-arounder deck that, again, might happen very fast, like Captain America. They're not necessarily tied to one another. You might also be saying, okay, well, are generalists the only decks you can have for solo? And this one, I say no, but the answer is pretty close to yes. In general, in solo, you want to be able to handle all the things because you don't have teammates to rely on to. So this is a concept I look a lot more into in multiplayer. But that being said, we've seen lots of success with Star-Lord rush decks, with Hawkeye just do all the damage decks and ignore everything else. So you can definitely still be a specialist and be viable in solo, but you're going to be a little bit tougher on your luck when bad encounter cards flip up. So it's going to have to be a very fast one. The other problem in solo is if you are going to win in solo, at some point you have to deal villain damage. So if the thing you specialize in is threat removal or defending, that's going to be really hard to do. You're going to be relying on your hero cards and the couple cards you might include to push villain damage, and that's like setting yourself up for a really long, possibly not sustainable game. So think about that a little bit before you decide you want to build a specialized solo deck, but definitely still doable. So let's look into these roles a little bit closer. A generalist is typically a deck that's going to be built to shore up a hero's weakness. And what I mean by that is if your hero is really good at one thing, like Hawkeye is really good at dealing damage, not so good at the thinking and removing threat stuff. So maybe you run a Hawkeye Justice deck that includes 25 cards to help him remove threats and handle threats that come to the board, and then he counts on his hero cards, those 15 cards, to shell out all his damage. You're going to be able to competently remove threat or deal damage depending on what comes out of the board states. You're going to kind of have an even split or a way to sustain your game until you have a way to manage what comes out into the board. Often, this prefers like a 2-2-2 stat line or 2-2x, because I've mainly wasn't thinking about defending as one of these things, but I think you can also count like defending as like a third thing you could specialize in. You want to be able to do all 3 if you're a generalist. So having a 2-2-2 stat line is really going to enhance that. If you have 1 thwart and even if you've included 20 threat removal cards in your deck, there's a chance you draw none of them. And then what do you do when you need to remove threat if you got a 1 thwart? You sit around and wait for next turn, right? So really got to focus on having that 2-2-2 stat line or figuring out a good way to deck build to make that work. These are very strong solo play decks. All of the best solo play decks that I've played are generally generalists. So Captain America Leadership, Doctor Strange Anything, Iron Man, Captain Marvel, anything. They're very generalized. They can probably handle whatever threats are thrown at them. Your peak damage might be lower, but it's still possible to have really high peak damage or really high threat control or really high anything in a generalist deck. But on average turn, your damage is probably going to be a little bit lower. So what about a specialist? Typically, instead of shoring up a weakness, a specialist is going to try to enhance that character's strength. So if your character is real good at dealing damage, add some more things that make them deal damage even better. If they're really good at making sure there's never threat on the board, make it so that it's like a Sherlock guarantee. You go all in on one strategy. It's very difficult in solo play, but it's very strong in multiplayer because the team can always count on you to do this one thing. Let's just say you're building a Drax or a Spider-Man defense deck, and they can almost always count on you for 2 defenses, whether you're using some sort of readying gimmick, or you're backflipping, or you're soaking your own and defending for someone else. You are going to be the defending king or queen. Your peak or damage of your peak damage or thwart or defense capability is going to be very, very, very high, but your capability in other areas of the game is going to be a little bit lower. And remember, this can be bursty or ramp driven, so it can take you a while, but then once you're set up, Black Widow Protection is one that makes me always think of that. She can be this awesome triple defender in multiplayer, but it takes her a while to get there because she's got to get her synth suit, and she's got to get an armored vest, and she's got to get a couple other things so that she can stay in hero form and not have to flip down. And it takes a while, but then eventually you've got this rock star character. Alright, so aspect selections. A lot of times, to me, this falls into aspect selection. It doesn't have to. You can still build a generalist or a specialist with the same aspect, and we'll do that next in this video. But if I was playing as Hawkeye, right? I play as Hawkeye a lot. He's very good at dealing damage, so if I wanted to be a specialist, I'm probably going to go Hawkeye aggression. Maybe Hawkeye leadership, because leadership kind of falls into everything. But that's a thing that I could make a very specialized Hawkeye deck in. It's going to become my turn, I'm going to deal 10 damage, and I'm going to pass it to the next player, and that's all I can do. Or I could build a Hawkeye Generalist deck, and here I want to shore my weakness. So Hawkeye's very, very bad at removing threat. Outside of his cable arrow, he's pretty much got nothing. So if you bring Justice with some confusion and some threat control, some cheap threat control hopefully, you can shore up your weakness, which is economy and threat control, and really have a lean deck that leans on the hero for damage and the other deck building cards for threat control that can sort of handle whatever situation comes up. Likewise for Black Widow, I could make a Black Widow specialist deck where I am super good at threat control. Threat does not get placed on the scheme, or I remove it immediately, or I confuse the villain and slap them in the face for even thinking of such things. Or I can build a very specialized protection deck for Black Widow where I rally around her synth suit and all her control capabilities that sort of defend the team and protect the team, and I can make a really cool deck that way. Or I could be a more generalist Black Widow. Generally, she has a little bit lower damage output. She's counting on canceling things to get that ping damage and her Dance of Death. But if I bring some powerful attack events from aggression, I can make her a very generalist character where she's relying on her hero kit control and covert hops for threat, and then relying on aggression for some beat-em-up damage. I like to say when I'm thinking about making a multiplayer deck to think about how you're building a team. Right, you're assembling a team of 1 to 4 heroes. In a 4-player game, you could all run specialist decks, and they could all focus on different things. What I like to do is compare these to MOBA roles from video games. If you've ever played a game like that before, a lot of times there's a character that's the attack/carry. They get really high level, really bursty, really damagey. There's a character that's going to defend for everybody and run in front of the attacks and shield the team and do all sorts of things. There's going to be a character that's very good at controlling and battlefield manipulation and stunning and confusing and things like that. Or there's going to be characters that are more generalists. There's always going to be that person on your team that joins the team selection and they fill, right? Let the other 4 people pick their character. You're going to take whatever fills in the cracks between the team composition. And this is really helpful in a 4-player game. If you have 3 people bringing decks and you haven't discussed all the decks ahead of time, if you bring a generalist character, regardless of what everybody else brings, unless you all bring a Captain America deck, you can probably fill in the gap on any given turn of what's needed. Support characters and jungle characters from MOBA games are very similar. They're characters that sort of can fit into any lane or partner up with any other character and still work out pretty well. So when assembling your team, I'd encourage you to try to make your team more of a generalist across the 4 characters, if you can sort of do everything, whether one character is a super attacker, one character is a super thwarter, one character is a super defender, or whether all three of them are kind of generalist, just make sure as a team you can handle whatever comes through. Can you be a bit of both? Totally. Don't overthink it. I'm throwing all these rules at you like that they're like the perfect rules for deck building, and they aren't. In general, the 15 card hero kits you get when you choose your hero, they already make you a generalist. Like, everybody has some sort of thwart or has two base thwart and a readying mechanic already. Everybody has some kind of damage. Everybody has some kind of mitigation. That's just how they have designed this game. But it's all about where you go from there. So you have to choose, do I want to take these 15 cards, figure out what the weakest part of the game is for me, and try to fix that? Or do I want to take these 15 cards, figure out what the strongest part of the game is, and try to make that just that much more amazing? So think about those things. Figure out if you want to fill gaps or if you want to totally focus on one thing. Whatever that thing might be, you focus on it and make sure you are the best at it. So here's two examples of decks I made real quick earlier today. I wanted to make Black Widow Justice decks that could be both Specialist or Generalist. So this is a Black Widow Justice Specialist deck. It's all about pure control, and I'm trying to enhance Black Widow's strength of threat control. She's got a base 2 thwart. Covert Ops is an amazing ability. Having an ally that comes out with 2 thwart for basically free, also pretty amazing. So we're going to focus on things like confusing the villain with Sonic Rifle, removing threat all the time with things like Impede, and setting up this steady flow of threat curbing so that whatever you draw, you're making sure threat gets removed with cards like Beat Cop and Counterintelligence and Spycraft to cancel those advances and stuff like that. You could also make a Black Widow Justice deck that's more of a generalist. And here I'm trying to make like a powered up punch. So I want to short my weakness. My weakness is mainly that my damage is basically Dance of Death and triggering all these abilities, which makes for a really long game. So I want to add cards that like find ways to deal damage. So we're looking at things like Turn the Tide, we're looking at things like Followed, and if you have one way or another, hopefully you can bring out the schemes that let you trigger all of those. One thing I really like to do in generalist decks is focus really, really hard on card draw. Like, card draw is good in this game, but for a generalist deck, it's almost essential, because if you don't draw into the right thing you need to solve the puzzle for this turn, you're stuck treading water for a turn, and you get further and further behind. But if you have a lot of card draw, by the time you get to turn 2 or 3, you've got a Skilled Investigator out, and you have a Nick Fury in hand. Well, now even if you don't draw what you need, you can draw 4 more cards and hopefully get to it. So that's the concept here. So just some closing remarks on role selection. Pick a role. Pick either Generalist or Specialist. And I encourage everybody to try this in their deck building and see just how much it changes the way they build a deck. So if you're going to be a generalist, you want to be an all-arounder who can handle whatever threat hits the table. So if your character is really good at thwarting, bring a lot of damage in your backup cards. Still bring a little bit of thwarting if you think you need it, right? If you're medium at thwarting but bad at damage, which there's not a lot of heroes that are bad and only medium in another category. But in general, try to shore up that weakness. That's what I would encourage you to do every time you're picking one of your 25 cards. Make sure that you have an answer to many situations. Look at your cards and say, okay, well, if a minion comes out with guard, does that shut my deck down? Or if I get confused, does that completely shut my deck down? And bring things in your deck that counteract those things that can just completely shut you down. The other role you could choose is a specialist. So what here, you want to be the best at what you do. So if you want to be a damage dealer, you're going to make it so that you're dealing 10 to 15 damage a turn, no questions asked. And if something gets in your way, you're probably going to ignore it and expect the rest of the team to take care of it. Really enhance your strength and go wild. And again, you still have to be super conscious during deck building because you can't stray too far from your objective. If you're trying to build this damage deck, and let's say you get to include 25 cards in your deck, and you include 15 cards that enhance your attacks, and then you're like, okay, well, I'm really nervous about threat, and I want to put some allies in there because allies OP, and all of a sudden you've included 10 other cards. Well, now all of a sudden you have this deck with a mixed identity. And this is when you're going to say, okay, well, I have all my awesome hero kit attack stuff out, and I drew into a bunch of thwart. So I guess I really inefficiently remove 2 threat, and then I do my base attack. That's what you don't want to fall into. You don't want to fall into that trap, so make sure when you're choosing cards to include in your deck, if you're going to be a specialist, that every card you pick is something that enhances your gameplay or lets you pivot if you really, really need it. So that's my concept on being a generalist for specialist. Let me know what you think about this sort of role selection and deck building style in the comments below. And we'll catch everybody tomorrow for another few Marvel Minutes with Kennedy Hawk. Have a great day.